I don't think my views are radical, but like I guess if you ask a regular person that is not involved in drug policy or harm reduction, then I would be considered like a quote unquote radical.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Yarelix Estrada works around drugs in many different ways. In fact, I think you could call her a psychoactive Renaissance woman. With a degree in public health from Johns Hopkins, she studies harm reduction for the city of New York with a focus on drug users in crisis. As an activist, she founded a chapter of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. As an organizer, she currently runs the New York Psychedelic Society, and she helped organize the first People of Color in Psychedelics conference in Washington, D.C. She lectures widely on issues like psychedelic intersectionality and the nuances of treating trauma with psychedelics in underrepresented populations. And in something we didn't even get to touch on today, she's also a CrossFit coach and a weightlifter. So how's that for Renaissance? Today, she shares on aspects of psychedelics that don't get heard as much by the white middle-class users. Poor people can have a very different drug experience than wealthy people, and it's even worse when you incorporate racism and white supremacy. Yarelix Estrada has dedicated her life to responding to those problems. She's a great speaker with sharp insights and a lot of experience. I enjoy learning from her very much, and I think you will too. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today with Yarelix Estrada, and thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So the first thing I wanted to ask about, your current job title is Field Research Associate at New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. So can you tell us what you do there?
So I guess I just want to start out by saying, because this is a government institution, that all the thoughts and opinions and things I say are not representative of the organization. They're my own thoughts, feelings, etc.
Good. Duly noted.
Yes. I work as a field research associate. My city title, because there's different titles, is a city research scientist. And like it's a bunch of jargon, so I'll go through it and then I'll dissect what exactly I do. So I work in a team called the Rapid Assessment and Response Team. And basically we are housed within the Research and Surveillance Unit at the Health Department. And they're epidemiologists that are always looking at the data around overdose, around emergency room data specific to people who use drugs and people who end up in the emergency room or have issues because of alcohol. And they're constantly monitoring these trends. And whenever there are trends that are either concerningly high or different from what we would expect, then they send us out to basically figure out what's going on. So for example, if there's a spike in overdose that's specific to the Bronx or the South Bronx, then my team would go out as people who are used like doing research out in the field, and we would do different kinds of research modalities. Like we would do observational research, so we would go like in plain clothes and just like hang out and see what's going on. We sometimes do stakeholder interviews, so stakeholders could be people who use drugs themselves, people who provide services to people who use drugs, like drug treatment programs, providers, pharmacists, and also do engagement with different levels of, in this like systemic hierarchy, right? Like other city agencies, elected officials, community-based organizations, people like that, groups like that. And then based on the information that we collect, we try to create some fast response to try to deal with the issue because, you know, historically when we're using policy or when we're using something internal at the health department or like with, you know, government in general, it's just really slow. So the goal of our team is to create a response that's faster than all of that and hopefully help with whatever's going on, which right now a lot of it is increases in overdose in the city.
And so how would your team respond to overdoses and what tools would you have to try to help?
The interesting position or the interesting role that we have that I really like about my job is we have two roles in one. So the one that I explained just now was the the research component where we're going out, we're using different modalities to try to figure out what's going on and then also do some sort of fast response. But while we're doing the research, we're not just like going out and asking questions and like, leaving. We're also providing whatever services we can, which because of the system that we're living within, because of the system that we're working within, isn't enough and it isn't what it should be. Um, but in all the interactions that we do, we provide naloxone training. So naloxone is a medication that's an opioid reversal medication that if someone has an overdose, then if they use this, then it can reverse the overdose and save their life, assuming that they get help within the time period that the medicine is working. um, we also always carry like wound care kits. We carry food if we have that. So sometimes when we're engaging people who use drugs, for example, if we're engaging a population of unhoused folks and we go to encampments, for example, like areas where people don't do outreach or areas where some people may do outreach, but they always need food, they always need resources. So we go there and bring them the things and offer whatever support that we have. Um, and a larger scale of what we do there is we also do kind of like large scale community organizing. So, for example, we'll have some topic that is specific to an issue that the city is going on with, is dealing with, and we'll ask the different stakeholders that I mentioned, to come together in a room. So, like, we'll have elected officials, people from the community, people from community-based organizations, people from other government agencies, and we'll come together and be like, "This is the problem. We are literally all the stakeholders that hold the power to change what's going on. What do we do?" And facilitating that space is quite interesting because you would think, I don't know, sometimes we think that like government agencies or even senators like have the power to change things. And it's all, I often hear this like my hands are tied response, which is sad. Um, but yeah, so there's a facet of our work that is doing direct service by literally bringing materials and resources into communities that maybe don't feel comfortable coming out to get those resources. And then we also do this large scale organizing where we're trying to advocate for the things that people who use drugs want. So, like in a lot of issues, there's people like when people want to help someone, like this the idea of helping, like oftentimes the thing that people don't do is ask the people that they're trying to help what they want. So when we go out to people who use drugs, we like ask them what's going on and then ask them like, what do you want? And then from that information, we take that to the city agencies, the elected officials, the like people with power, and we're like, this is what they want. Like we're not really trying to appease the general public, which that's my stance. I really advocate for people who use drugs first and then kind of go from there, if that makes sense.
It does. It's actually one of the things that really stands out on your resume. You went to Johns Hopkins for undergrad and then a master's in public health there, which is one of the best programs in the world. And you worked on a lot of projects there. And one of the things that you seem to do a lot of is interview people who use drugs. And personally, I believe that's the strongest way to find out what's really going on in the real world. So I wanted to ask, how do you approach these interviews and what did you learn about how to ask the best questions?
It's been interesting because I've been interviewing different groups of people for different reasons for a while. That's been kind of my research with folks who use drugs has been so my first introduction into research was when I was doing work at the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit at Johns Hopkins. And there I was doing some like preliminary interview questions, but the primary responsibility that I had was to just make people that come into the clinic comfortable. And a lot of the people that would come into the clinic were people that were withdrawing from opiates in order to get into the study. And if anyone's ever withdrawn from opiates or know someone who has, like, it's an extremely uncomfortable experience. Like it's very not fun, very physically painful and emotionally also. Because when your body doesn't feel good physically, emotionally you start to get impacted as well. And so I had to just like hold space for all the study participants that were withdrawing. And this was it became kind of like a norm in the other positions that I had as well. That I just had to like be able to hold a space where people that were going through this suffering would even want to acknowledge my presence, which like if you're withdrawing from opioids, like you don't want to talk to anyone. um, and so that was helpful for the next jobs that I had. I did interviews in hospitals, and now I do interviews out in the community where people might be using or might be withdrawing or going through whatever. Um, and as far as the questions, we usually use a questionnaire that was pre-approved. But for me, like it was important to offer a space where people who use drugs could have someone to talk to. So I tried to use the questionnaire as little as possible and structure it more of like a conversation, and allow it to be just a place where they can vent to me, you know, and some people needed that, some people didn't need that. But for some people, like when they interact with the systems that we're living in, like the hospital system, the social work system, I'm not even going to mention the criminal justice system because that's just like, it's not, it's not something that's meant to help people. They aren't listened to. They're often just told what to do, or they're treated in this very like patronizing way. And so whenever I would meet with them, I just wanted to, first of all, get them to trust me because I'm just a random person. There's no way to know my intentions. And when you're someone who uses drugs, it's especially when you're a person who uses drugs that's of color, like there's so much distrust in all these systems because of the ways that they've suffered through them. And I just wanted to make them comfortable and allow them to talk to me about their life and their drug use. And like, people, as someone who uses drugs, I like talking about my drug use. um, and so, other people that I interviewed also enjoyed doing that. So I'd say that that's the two most important things for me when I've been doing interviews and like holding space for folks who use drugs. It's just like making sure that they're comfortable, um, being patient with them, and making it more of a conversation rather than like, okay, I'm going to read you the next 10 questions and have it being like cut and dry. This is for an interview. I'm not like trying to get to know you as a person.
Wow. It sounds like your job is a really fascinating mix of hands-on harm reduction and high-level public health research. And I was curious what it's like to work from within the system when city and state systems often aren't as approving of the harm reduction model.
Yeah. So that's something that is really interesting to grapple with. So I previously worked, like I interned at the Drug Policy Alliance before I had this job. And I also worked in places that generally like got it, like people who are very harm reduction oriented. So I didn't have to do any explaining around that, and could vocalize my views around harm reduction, which I don't think my views are radical, but like I guess if you ask a regular person that is not involved in drug policy or harm reduction, then I would be considered like a quote unquote radical. Um, when I moved to the Department of Health, it was interesting because my team specifically is very radical. They are very harm reduction oriented. And even within my bureau, the orientation of my research unit is very harm reduction oriented. Um, but, the longer that I've worked in city government, the more I've understood that, yeah, like as an institution and inside of the city as a whole, it's not very harm reduction oriented. And also just like when I engage with people who have worked with city government, they're just like, there's this idea of harm that the government causes to people, which is totally real, and something that I've struggled with is I'm used to being this kind of loud advocate that is, I go to rallies and I go to protests, and I have arguments with people about harm reduction on the internet and in person. Um, and so when I'm in the sphere of the government, and I've realized like I can't freely do that anymore, And I could to a degree, like if I use fancy language or if I back it up with science, then I can. But it's been difficult, to balance who I am as a person and the tendencies that I have and this like governmental space. Um, because ultimately, a place like the health department is meant to serve all of New York, right? And it's meant to serve even those people who hate people who use drugs. It's meant to serve even those people who want people who use drugs to be dead. And my place inside of the health department is not to serve those people. My place is to serve people who use drugs. And I'm, I hit walls because of that. Because even if my team and even if my unit wants what's best for people who use drugs, when our work tries to leave our team or our unit, it sometimes doesn't make it out because it's too political, or um, it's not something that the city wants to be representative of. Um, so yeah, it's definitely a difficult line to balance. But what I do appreciate is at the end of the day, like the outreach that I do, no one can control the outreach that I do. No one can control how I engage the communities that I engage with. And part of my job is I talked a lot about engaging people who use drugs, but I also engage community members themselves. Part of our work is to do kind of like anti-stigma work where we're like, hey, do you know people who use drugs? Do you talk to people who use drugs? And these are people that live in high impacted areas around the city. And just like having a conversation with them about people who use drugs in their life or in their community and trying to change that narrative. Because oftentimes, like, for example, if it's someone who works at a bodega, um, they may think nasty things about people who use drugs because the only experience or the only reference they have is someone who is always, overdosing or like nodding out in front of their store. Um, but if we talk to them and just change their orientation about like, this is a community member, this is someone's friend, this is someone's family member, and also sometimes dig deeper into some of the feelings of resentment that they have. Sometimes it turns out that it's because of personal trauma that they've had. Um, so being able to have those conversations, make it worth it because no one's monitoring me in that scenario. And a lot of the times the communities that I'm engaging are communities of Black and Latinos. So it's people that I care about and people that I feel called to, you know, to have these conversations with as another Latina.
That's actually a great place to shift to your work as an activist around the war on drugs, because you founded a chapter of SSDP in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins. And for those who don't know, SSDP is Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and they're an amazing program predominantly run by college students to fight the war on drugs. And it's basically a training ground for a whole generation of activists who go on to do great things. So I would say donate to them. So, Yarelix, when did you first start becoming aware of the war on drugs? And how did that lead to you founding a chapter of SSDP?
I started learning about the war on drugs mainly in college, although, this issue had been present in my life. I just didn't know how to name it. So I'll say how I learned about it first, and then I will tie it back to like my personal experience. But um, I started doing volunteer work as a case manager in Baltimore, and it was kind of crazy that I was given this responsibility because I was this like 20-year-old student that knew nothing, and they were just like, here are all these people that have all the problems. Try to get them services. And I was like, wow, okay. um, so I got to meet people and learn their stories. Like, again, kind of back to this like interviewing perspective, but it wasn't for the sake of research. It was literally just me navigating the system and trying to get them help. And I met a lot of people that were incarcerated. I met a lot of people that used drugs and were incarcerated because of their drug use. And then after that, couldn't get services, couldn't get housing, couldn't get a lot of their basic needs met. And I saw this pattern. And the more that I started getting interested in substance use and people who use drugs and learning more about that policy, I was like, why is all this happening, especially in a place like Baltimore? Like Baltimore has issues with job security for a lot of Black people that have lived there because of like historic redlining, and other policies that have oppressed people over time. But it wasn't until I started reading up more on the history of how these cities were made and the disparities between the wealthy and the poor in the area that I learned that this was like a pattern, but also something that was somewhat intentional. Um, and on a personal level, I grew up in a low income community of color in Miami, Florida, in Carroll City. And, I went to a school that it wasn't weird for kids to have guns and drugs and for police to come in and do random searches on us. But that was just part of my reality, like that was just like how I just assumed that everywhere was like this, because I didn't know a life that was any different. Um, and I've had people in my family that have gone to jail for issues around drugs, and it was just a part of life, because a lot of my friends, a lot of people that I knew dealt with the same issues. Um, but it wasn't again until I left to Baltimore that I went to Johns Hopkins that I was like, wait, like, so Baltimore is a certain way. People go to jail for using drugs in Baltimore, especially if you're Black. But then you go to this institution, this very white, rich institution like Johns Hopkins, and it's not like that at all. Like, I felt so confused when I went, and I was like, oh, I'm the only poor person here. I'm the only person that went to a school that had random searches and had gangs and had like gun violence. I mean, probably not the only person, but it felt that way. And people at Johns Hopkins use drugs, like rich white kids use cocaine, and they don't go to jail. They're like praised for being more productive, or they're like praised for being popular because they go to frat parties. Um, so it was these like interactions through my volunteer work, and also just realizing like, oh, I'm also a part of this. Like I have experienced some of this in my own life. I just didn't have a name for it, which I later found out through reading like Drug Policy Alliance articles and reading literature that it was the drug war.
Hey folks, it's sponsor time. The company is CV Sciences, the product is Plus CBD, and the discount code for 20% off is Lex Files. And remember, the top 3 reasons to use that code on pluscbdoil.com. Number 1, I would give Plus CBD to your grandmother, because I gave it to my grandmother. Number 2, I was the biggest skeptic. Then I started studying the endocannabinoid system. Number 3, I know firsthand that CV Sciences is committed to pure science and to enhancing well-being. So when you find yourself in need of CBD from true agricultural hemp, consider Plus CBD, the number 1 CBD brand in the United States. That coupon code is LexFiles, and the place to use it is pluscbdoil.com. It's intriguing that you have this social justice mindset with the war on drugs, and then recently you did a talk for the Sabina Project, who, by the way, is an excellent group to follow for anyone listening, about psychedelic intersectionality and social justice. And so can you tell us what that talk was about and your general thoughts there?
So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And intersectional theory asserts that people are often disadvantaged by multiple sources of oppression. So, for example, their race, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their religion, their immigration status, ableism, and other identity markers. And these different identities may impact how safe someone feels in, simply existing or talking about certain topics, being in certain spaces, and also just access to general survival needs that they might have. So, for example, healthcare, therapy, education, healthy food supplies. And so the talk that I did was because, I have this background in harm reduction and in drug policy, and I also have this world in psychedelics that I'm a part of. I don't feel that the two are separate, even though a lot of mainstream media or a lot of people that I've had conversations with feel that they don't intersect at all. that psychedelics, and I think that this is because it's like a Western thing, right? That psychedelics are this like very individualistic thing that's used to optimize the self. And to me, that's not what psychedelics are. To me, it's like about communal healing and for me, it's just like because of how I've been able to change my life or how my life has changed through my use of psychedelics, I have been able to feel activated and to be able to be emotionally sustained to do the work that I do. And, the work that I do is emotionally draining, like quote unquote, fighting the system is hard. And honestly, the only reason I feel like I've been able to do that is because I've had the experiences that I've had with psychedelics that have allowed me to overcome some of my issues with anxiety and depression and also find meaning within my own life and meaning within the work that I do. So basically the talk that I did, it was with Sabina Project. So if you haven't heard of Sabina Project, you should check them out. It's an amazing group. And I went through a lot. I talked about my own experience. I talked about psychedelic history, how psychedelic history, quote unquote, like about how entheogens have been used through all millennia by indigenous people, and then colonization, white supremacy, drug policy, the war on drugs, how psychedelic policy is changing today, now that we're seeing decriminalization efforts around the country, and then tying that into psychedelics and social justice, because to me, social justice means like fighting for equity. It means trying to dissolve these systems of oppression for individual and collective liberation. And that's what psychedelic use to me is. Like we're liberating ourselves from these systems that we're within. We're able to absolve the systems of oppression in our mind, to be able to be released and see that this world doesn't have to be this way, that we don't have to continue allowing the system to run as it is, that we can, think about things that are different. We can fight for things that are different. And so I think the main inspiration for why I talk about these things is because I was previously someone who was so not functional. Like I was so anxious and I was so depressed that all I could really do was like make it through school. I had no friends. I didn't know how to socialize. Every time I tried to socialize, I would have panic attacks. And through my use of psychedelics, like I found myself. I learned to trust others for the most part. And I found this field of work that I absolutely love and that I feel activated by. And if I was able to go from this person that had all these issues to someone who's like an advocate and an organizer, I think we can do so much. Like so much can be done with psychedelics for the purpose of like activating ourselves and becoming more empathetic and like trying to change this system, because this system is so broken.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. It is fascinating that you had that much anxiety and now you're such an organizer and connector around the psychedelic world. Yarelix is now is leading the New York City Psychedelic Society, which is a society that's very grounded in inclusivity and community. And you also helped to organize the first People of Color in the Psychedelics Conference in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to ask, why is it important to have safe spaces that are reserved for people of color?
So I can give a little backstory to my organizing, and that might give some context. So I co-founded the Baltimore Psychedelic Society with Mike Margulies, and it was a great experience to learn how to organize. I had no idea how to do community organizing, and I was still dealing with a lot of my social anxiety and panic attacks and things like that at the time. So it was my first introduction into the psychedelic space, which at the time there wasn't a lot of in-person spaces aside from conferences. Like there weren't a lot of community spaces for people to talk about psychedelics. And at the time I was just building up based on how I was taught. So, just talking about psychedelics, getting people through the door. And for the most part, a lot of the early psychedelic societies, and even now, a lot of psychedelic societies that exist are very white, and they're sometimes very white male dominated. Um, and I found that to be true of the Baltimore Psychedelic Society, not necessarily the male part, but it was very white middle class. And it just, with me being a psychedelic organizer, serving community for middle class white people, but then working full time with people who are unhoused, being oppressed by the system, overdosing and dying, that are mainly Black and brown people, I was just like, this isn't aligning with what I want to do. Like, this doesn't feel right. So I stopped organizing for a while, and when I moved to New York, I had the opportunity to start organizing again. And because I had the opportunity to organize previously, I was like, okay, this time I'm going to be much more intentional about what I'm doing. Like, I want Black and brown people that haven't had access to psychedelics, or at least information about psychedelics, to have that. And I want them to have a space that feels safe to talk about these things and to reflect on themselves. Um, so I currently organize the New York City Psychedelic Society, and two of the main things that we do are create educational events, and I organize psychedelic integration circles for people of color. And for the integration circle specifically, like, I've been to a lot of integration circles, and they've been great, and I've learned a lot from the people who've hosted them and from the spaces that I've been in. But there was always something missing. First of all, I was almost always the only person of color in the room, and a lot of the experiences that I would have are tied to issues around my family, around trauma that we've had because of migration. I'm first generation Central American, so my family migrated here because of, like, United States state violence, and that's kind of shaped the way that we live in this country, and the way that I frame the United States. I don't view it as a place that is my home. That, I mean, I live here, of course, but it's not somewhere that I'm like, oh, I'm proud to be an American. Like, that's never the stance that I come from. And I would have experiences that were about, like, intergenerational trauma and my community and immigration, and just intense topics like that when I would bring it up in these predominantly white circles, it would either just kind of like fade into the ether, like no one says anything, or someone would feel really uncomfortable and feel compelled to respond. And that almost made me feel worse, because I'm just like, I just want someone to understand where I'm coming from, but they don't, and so I thought to myself, like, how do I get people of color in the room? And then I was like, I don't even feel comfortable in this room. Why would I want to come to this room as a person of color? And so I started organizing this separate space, and it was like, this is only people of color, because a lot of folks of color, like, don't want to be in a predominantly white space if they don't have to be, because we do that all the time. We're always in white dominated spaces, and we're tired, like, we're at work and we have to be code switching just to be able to fit in with the conversation, or we have to fit this mold that we hide parts of ourselves. And when we're having our psychedelic experiences, things that are so powerful and so profound and so intimate, it's really amazing and healing to be able to be in a space where I can just, like, talk about my experience and have someone in the room be like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Or like, yeah, I have experienced that too. Because and we're seeing this now, right? Like, with the uprisings and everything, there are so many people that, like, claim to be unaware of how the system interacts with people that have been historically oppressed by the system. And I don't really, I spend a lot of my time helping people who use drugs, advocating for them against, like, government institutions, and that is tiring. I don't have time to educate someone who can't go on the internet and Google how racism exists. Like, this is free information. And that's sometimes what would happen in these integration circles, where someone would be like, oh, I didn't know that happened. I'm just like, I don't want to talk to you about this. Like, I don't want to explain this history of myself to you. And it's really wonderful to be able to have spaces where people of color can just exist.
Thank you for pulling those together. They do sound really powerful. And so it actually leads into the last question I wanted to ask about. You were recently participating in the panel Treating Trauma with Psychedelics in Underrepresented Populations. And so could you share what are the special factors to consider in using psychedelics to treat trauma in underrepresented populations?
Sure. So I will say that I don't have a background in either therapy or treating trauma. But I do have experience in engaging folks that have trauma, because they're oftentimes some of the most oppressed people in our society. So again, going back to my work with people who use drugs, people that are unhoused, people that have extreme mental illness, or mental illness that doesn't allow them to participate in the capitalist society in the way that would, the way that the society expects them to. And I also have experience organizing these spaces for people of color to come together and share their experiences. And it's a lot, right? It's a lot of layers. I think the biggest thing to acknowledge is that we're operating in the system of white supremacy, and how difficult that makes it for us to do anything. So specifically the people of color, a lot of us don't have health care. Some of us are unhoused. A lot of us don't have a stable job. Like, it's hard to get basic needs met when you don't have income. And especially now during COVID, during these times, like, everything is even more unstable. And so my other point with the psychedelics and social justice topic is, we can't really be advocating for psychedelic therapy if we are also not advocating for people's basic survival needs, right? Because if I'm someone who, let's say I'm someone who's unhoused, has a substance use disorder, and I don't know, and have an abuser that is out in the community, in the city, and I get selected to do some like psychedelic therapy, and I go and do it. Yeah, I could probably unpack some stuff. I could probably work things out, and maybe I can have some relief from the trauma and learn some things about myself. But if I go back into the system that is beating me up, that is abusing me, not having housing, not having food, not having these basic things that I need to be a functioning human and to prosper, like, what is that doing? And so first of all, it's just like advocating that everyone has their basic needs met. And when we're looking at institutions like the medical system, like, we know the medical system is racist. We know the criminal justice system is racist. We know all these institutions are racist, and it's harder for, like, Black people, for example, to get healthcare than it is white people. And these are disparities that we can't solve everything, but we can at least get educated on them. And when we hear about bills, hopefully we do our research. When we hear about bills that are coming out about supporting increases to Medicaid or increases to healthcare or universal healthcare, we can call our representatives and be like, hey, I'm supporting this thing because XYZ. That's like a low barrier way of doing this. But there's also other layers of community. So if someone doesn't have a community to go back to, and this is kind of like what I found, that I've been doing psychedelics for many years. I've been organizing around psychedelics for many years, but I feel like my healing process has not accelerated, but just become much more foundational now that I have a community of other people of color where I can, have my experience and then come back to it, be like, I need help integrating this. And this is in part with the psychedelic integration circles, but it's also just like having people that I love, that I know will talk me through some of the things that I'm processing. And so there's so many parts. I'll just go through what comes to mind. So the first is access. If we're talking about accessibility, we could be talking about, maybe someday we'll have psychedelic therapy centers that people can go to. The likelihood of that is not high unless you're someone who already has a decent job and healthcare and all these things, which is not the best, or not what it should be for people of color. Or you can go to an underground market and find an underground therapist and do it that way, which is what a lot of us have done, or a lot of us have just like gotten psychedelics and used them and figure that out for ourselves. But that's also dangerous, and in this society that criminalizes us, it disproportionately impacts people of color and their communities because of hyperpolicing and things like that. There's also a higher risk for that. And so a lot of people of color that are not currently plugged into psychedelics are afraid to get plugged in because they don't want to get arrested because of the war on drugs. But even if we do find someone to hold space for us, whether it be like through a therapeutic context or underground context, it's important for them to be, I don't know what the word is, like culturally competent is like the word that comes to mind, even though I hate that like whitewashed phrase. Because we need to feel safe in that space. And for people of color, like when we're having our experiences, like it is very spiritual. It's not like, I've seen these research studies about psychedelics that it's just like spirituality is like one sliver of the conversation. It's like, oh, mystical experiences is number one. Maybe it's spirituality, but that's not really the priority. And it's like, no, for a lot of folks of color, spirituality is the center of it. And our ancestry is the center of it. And going back to our roots and figuring out who we were before colonization, like that's what we find healing, and it gives our lives meaning, and it allows us to reclaim what we've lost in all this time. So yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done. I'd say like for us to even have the conversation about treating psychedelics with trauma, we first have to figure out how to create education that is tailored and appropriate for people of color, so that it's not the sensationalized messaging that we are seeing right now. And we also have to figure out how to make society more equitable, because if people of color have access to psychedelic therapy, sure, like we can do healing practices. But if we're constantly getting re-traumatized whenever we walk outside of our front door, that's not how we achieve healing. Like we have to try to make this system a more equitable place. And then, then we can take the psychedelics and have them be a catalyst for healing for us, but not without all these other things done first.
Amen. Wow. Yarelix Estrada, thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great talking with you.
And thank you for your work, working with the city, doing public health and harm reduction, and in bringing people together around community.
Awesome. Thanks, Lex.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, find us at pluscbdoil.com or on YouTube or on all the podcast platforms. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code Lex Files for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com or follow the podcast on Twitter at The Lex Files Show. If you enjoyed this program, please rate us on iTunes or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. And our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. Remember the coupon code Lex Files. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off. Signing off. Signing off. Signing off.